So we'll give everyone a couple of minutes, maybe another 2 minutes or so for us to admit everyone on before we begin. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Hall.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks for invitation.
So if you all don't know, Mr. Hall is now the new principal for Washington Liberty High School. And some of you may have known him from his days over at Swanson, and he's also been at Washington Liberty before as well. So
yeah. So definitely happy to be back here, and definitely ready to see all the students and chat with all the students and staff. So I know there's a lot of work to be done before then, but it's an exciting time. So I'm happy to be with y'all, truly.
I think we're waiting for a few more. So if you can, Mr. Hall, if you can help me moderate a discussion. So for hand raising, I think it's a smaller group than we had at the middle school. So it should be a lot of more engaging conversation with everyone here, due to being a smaller group of students that we have with us. And students, you're always able to use the chat feature too. That's to the right of the hand symbol that says show your conversation. You can always chat there. You raise your hand with the little hand symbol in the middle. It says raise your hand. I'm pretty sure many of you have already been using Microsoft Teams in classes, so you're probably pretty familiar with the layout here that we have. To get started, really, in terms of why are we having this talk is because several weeks ago, many of you may have watched the Let's Talk community conversation about race and racism that we did around in the evening time. Some of your families and parents probably hopefully watched and participated in that. And there are a lot of questions. But we also wanted to engage with our students. We think that's very important, is to hear your voices of what goes on in the classrooms and in the walls of the buildings where you're at, the things that you've seen, the things that you've heard, the things that are of concern for you and questions for you, to trying to raise those issues and bring them to the surface. I know right now there's no better time to do that due to the state of America and where we are with the protests and also the things that we saw on TV that have been traumatic for us. You know, we've watched some pretty horrific things. And this wasn't the first thing that's ever happened that has been horrific, but I think we're in a different time and a different place now, to where there's more sustained action. And I think that there's more people that are aware and have a sense of awareness and want to make change and see changes. One of the things I will say is that in our buildings, many of the teachers are saying, hey, what can we do? What can we say to our students? What can we do better? And I want to really listen to you all so that you can kind of give us some ideas on how we can better prepare for this year and for staff. We know that you had to deal with COVID-19, and that was one layer of being in this virtual model that we have, and then now with the racism in America that has surfaced and resurfaced again. So we just want to be able to open the discussion for you all, to be able to dialogue with us and amongst yourselves, and be able to answer some of the questions that you have. So I will turn it over, since it's a smaller group. I know that Nyla is from Yorktown. I know that Kirsten responded that she's from Yorktown. And I also see Alana, right? Is it Alana or Elena? It says McBride. Can you hear me?
Alana. Yeah, I'm from WNL.
WNL? Okay. Did
Yeah.
I pronounce your name correctly? Is it Elena or Alana? How do you say your name?
Alana. You pronounced it correctly.
Okay. All right, Alana. And then at the bottom of the screen, I see Dr. Wilmore just joined us. I'm trying to see if there's any other students that might be on here. Okay. Dr. Duran, you want to say a few words?
Sure. Get my camera on working, sorry. All right, I think it's working now. So I just want to say I'm here, excited to be here to listen and learn, and you may have some questions or maybe some suggestions. And so we had a great conversation a few minutes ago with our middle school students. They asked us some good questions, shared with us some thoughts for us to think about, and then also any suggestions you might have. So it's very important that we have this conversation. And I'll say to you students, you got a lot of adults here who have a ability to make some decisions and put things in place. So take advantage of giving us some suggestions or questions that you might have. So I'm here to listen, and I look forward to the next hour that we have together. Is it an hour or half an hour? I can't remember.
Hour.
Hour, yeah. Thank you.
How about we start? I know the first person that joined us was Kirsten. How about you?
I'm really sorry. I'm kind of nervous.
Don't be nervous.
Can I ask you what you've decided to do already? Because I watched like your the community talk you were talking about, and I heard lots about like more education and stuff, and like more like training on like bias stuff or whatever. But I was a little bit unsure of how you plan to implement that, and so I was just wondering a little bit about that.
So, Mr. Gregory, you want to talk about some of the training that we're planning and working with our teachers, and then maybe Mr. Hall or Mr. Wilmore, you want to add some of the stuff that you're planning to do in terms of training. And but you're right, we have put a lot of discussion about some training we want to do. We also talked a lot about how we're going to work on our curriculum and all the studies and make sure that they're more reflective of all students and everyone's history. So we're starting with social studies and history curriculum to make sure that we're telling the whole story, because right now we're not telling the whole story. And part of what we're telling and part of what's in the curriculum is actually very racist and very incorrect about folks, and telling people what happened in a way that's from one person's point of view, not everyone's point of view. So that's a lot of work that's going on there internally in our curriculum office that we're going to bring some changes to. But we have a lot of adults here who are helping in that. So I'll let Mr. Gregory start, and then we have Mr. Hall and Dr. Wilmore, I believe, and maybe even Officer Brooks might want to add some of the things he's doing, because he gave some good comments in the last time. So, Mr. Gregory?
Sure. So in our buildings, what I can tell you is that there are a lot of teachers right now that are doing some book studies and reading amongst themselves and their colleagues to learn about race, racism, bias, and those types of topics. Right before school ended, I know that you all had like a full virtual week, right? And there was with interaction, and during that week was a professional development and professional learning week for our staff and our teachers, and there are modules for teachers to be able to watch and also reflect that had to deal with equity and diversity and inclusion. Those things, as we were entering school, there will be, a week prior to the beginning of school in August, where staff will also be able to participate in learning around equity. We're also looking into developing systems within our buildings and equity teams to be able to talk and to discuss about race. And those equity teams will include some of you all that want to be able to participate, as well as not as well as only you, but also your families in the community, because it's a community thing, right? So when we look at our education, it's not just about the building, but it's also about the community. And that includes our parents and our community and everybody. So we want to make sure that those opportunities are open to you all as being a part of that equity team. One of the things that the superintendent and I talked about when we first had our initial talk was really about student ambassadors. And having our students being the ones who are leading this work in their buildings. So we know that students hear best from their own peers, and we want to make sure that we empower you all. And that's part of this conversation, is to be able to, when you hear something, say something, and not just let it go by as being okay. And we also, I know when I was growing up in school, there were a lot of things that are being said, and sometimes I brushed it off because I didn't think anyone was going to do anything about that. Or, they're going to hear so much from me that, it was like the little, little boy that cried wolf all the time. Well, things aren't okay. And it wasn't okay for me, and it's not okay for you all. So we have to help empower you to be able to speak up and to tell someone so that we can do something about it, because it's not okay in our schools. And I want to turn it over maybe to Dr. Hall and Dr. Wilmore to kind of mention about what they have planned on in their buildings on this topic.
First of all, good afternoon, everybody. Kristen, that's a good question. So let me just try to address that through 3 points, Kristen, and if I could, and to the rest of our group this afternoon. First of all, Kristen, I think when you look at racism and social justice and racial justice, certainly some of us, both young people and adults, have experienced some trauma as it relates to that. And our staff, before we left in the last school year, each one of our staff members underwent trauma-informed training to make sure that we can look at the signs of those young people who are experiencing distress, perhaps from the standpoint of experiencing an issue surrounding racism or racial injustice that they experience themselves or someone else. So we talked to our staff, and our staff underwent a series of trainings to be prepared for that. I think Aaron's point, Mr. Gregory's point is accurate in terms of equity teams. I talked to Dr. Duran about that. In that process, Dr. Duran and I talked about being vulnerable. I think it is an opportunity for us as the teachers and the leaders of these schools to be vulnerable in this process, to be able to recognize what we know and don't know, to be able to recognize that everyone, Kristen, has a bias in some way, to be vulnerable in talking about how that bias manifests itself in the walls of our classrooms and how we can then better be able to address that, to be better practitioners and build better relationships with our students. So I think the equity teams are important. Ibrahim X, whether it's Ibrahim X, whether it's White Fragility, any one of those books that we're examining, to be able to take a look and to not only be not racist, Kristen, that's not the opposite of racism is anti-racism. So we have to make sure that that message permeates throughout our building. And then, Kristen, I'm going to give you one more example in terms from an instructional aspect. Shelby County versus Holder. Now, for a lot of students, that may not mean much, but if you live in a place where there are a large group of minorities, and then I can say to you, okay, you had 1,000 polling places where you could vote, I'm going to slash that to 50. Well, if I'm Black and you slash my polling places from 1,000 polling places to 50, doesn't that make it inherently harder for me as a Black man to vote if I don't have as many places to go and vote? Those are the type of stories, Kristen, instructionally, that we have to be able to talk to our students and our communities about. Voting is a real thing. And when communities change the voting laws to make them inherently racist, we need to have those conversations with our students that in America, this is happening. That court case, that Supreme Court case, is a real thing. It wiped out a part of a lot of the Voting Rights Act that made it harder for citizens of color to vote. Not only that type of story, Kristen, but we know that the Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma, which initially a lot of that conversation came from an HBO series and people got curious about. We need people to understand that lots of community of color, they were trying to build economic wealth and self-sustaining mechanisms. But there were people who came in and sabotaged that to the point where people were killed. Whole towns were wiped out. A lot of that isn't taught, Kristen. So we need to be able to first have our teachers recognize the vulnerability and confronting the fact that teaching this might not be comfortable, equipping them with the tools necessary to be able to talk to you, the students and the young people, about these. And the last thing is to bring about systemic change to empower y'all as young people, as well as the older folks, to join with y'all to make sure things like the Black Wall Street Massacre or voting rights laws that are disenfranchising minorities and Blacks, and looking at law enforcement. We know that a new re-examining our MOU here with Arlington Public Schools and the Arlington County Police Department to be able to better our relationship with how our SROs serve us in the schools and in the community, Kristen. So policing, curriculum, looking at books and other materials that may help us, as well as trauma-informed education. We're taking a multi-pronged approach here at APS to try to serve y'all in that regard.
Thanks for that. And I would also wanted to chime in a little bit about my role, and the role of a chief diversity, equity, and inclusion officer is really to look at those underlying conditions that we have within this whole school system and disrupt and dismantle them. So we're looking at our policies, our procedures, and our practices. and trying to see what those underlying roots are, and dismantling those so that we can give our students access and opportunity. And that's how that's how we're going to change the landscape within APS and the landscape within our school systems. Digital learning has really caused a stir, and being in the virtual, and it really uprooted some of the inequities that we have within our system. So increasing the access to the technology for you all, to understanding what your needs are and hearing from you and your families. So those are some of the things that we have in play, Kirsten. So I wanted to turn the microphone over to Nyla and see if you had a question for us.
Yes, thank you. I would say, what are you all planning in Arlington? What are you planning to do on trying to diversify the more intense classes and like the AP classes, the honors, and the IB classes? Because like I said, I'm at Yorktown High School, and in 2 of my AP classes, I am the only African American student, and I'm not sure if my peers realize how unsettling that should be, but that is a really, really low number. And so I just wanted to know if you're all are planning on trying to fix that and bring more minority students into higher level classes, because education is important.
Mr. Hall, you want to tackle that one first?
You're on mute, Mr. Hall. Your mute is on.
Sorry, Dr. Duran. So Nala, thank you for the question. So if you go back a few years at WNL, we used to be at about 23% of the whole student body taking AP and IB courses. Right now, that's at about 99% of the last 4 or 5 graduating senior classes have taken at least one AP or IB course. One way we tried to increase that, Nyla, is to make sure that doing affinity groups where you have students who do sign up for where there are students of color, to make sure that we do try to group students in terms of using cluster or cohort model, so that when they are in classes, for example, if you're taking English 11 and we know that there are different sections, if you have them take that section together, perhaps you might be able to have a more comfort level, students being able to see themselves reflected in that classroom. I think that's one way you can do about that. I think there's an early identification process, to be honest with you, that we need to take a look at a little bit harder. You can't wait till you all get to high school to then begin to talk to you about AP and IB classes. We need to do a better job of going down to the middle schools and saying, look, here are the opportunities that await you at Washington Liberty, at Yorktown, at Wakefield. Know that these are open access situations unless there's a prerequisite that you have to take based on the program of studies, but it's an open access situation. Here is what we're doing as far as intro to advanced courses in the summer. As a freshman, come take this class and see that advanced courses are for you. Here's how we're going to be able to do that to shepherd you through those classes. I think also, Nyla, we increased IB enrollment by 30% for our students of color. That's not enough. So what do we need to do in the process? I think we're taking a look at the way we structure our IB classes to provide support through Saturday seminars, to have students come in as a group to be able to tackle how to do internal assessments, to provide additional layers of support so that you all feel comfortable with taking those classes. You feel empowered to be able to attack the text that you'll be reading. And then on the other side of that, Nyla, you're able to write more effectively and substantially based on that text, which is high level. So I think the early identification process in middle school, coming out to talk to you sooner. I think building those supports around being able to take those classes, whether it's intro to advanced courses, the affinity groups, or seminars to be able to support what you do during the week in those classes, are sort of all different ways that we're trying to make sure that students of color are taking these classes. You can tell your peers, here's the supports that they have, in addition to again, all of the unconscious bias and anti-racism initiatives that we have. I think once we do that, we'll be able to increase the enrollment so that we'll see more students of color in those classes.
All right, that's awesome. Thank you. Those are the points that you made were also things that I was thinking for how you could fix that issue. I can suggest I also have been thinking it's important for parents to understand the importance of these classes too. So maybe if you can implement a parent class or just a parent meeting saying, hey, this is why your students should have these opportunities because it will help them in the future.
And then I wanted to include Dr. Wilmore in the conversation too.
Hey, good afternoon. I agree that it's a great question, and the answers that we come up with are important. And I would second much of what Mr. Hall had to say. But I think a lot of what we need to do is listen to kids about why they're not in the classes. What is it that they need? We began that process at Wakefield about 20 years ago, because what we noticed is our AP and intensified classes did not look like Wakefield. And so we began a series of conversations with students about why they're not taking it. And some of what we heard, particularly from our Latino and African American boys, was no one looked like them in the class. Mm-hmm. And so that was the beginning of our cohort program. And I was just trying to look for the numbers, but back in 1999-2000 school year, we had 15 minority boys taking like 25 AP classes. Mm-hmm. In the 2018-2019 school year, we had over 350 minority boys taking over 500 AP classes. And that came from building the cohort program with the affinity groups, and then they impact even their friends beyond them. We heard from a lot of students that they didn't have time or resources at home to study. So we advocated to the school board to create a course called AP Consult. That is like a study hall for students with an AP class. And we tried to make as many of their AP teachers available to them. When we talked to some of our minority girls, they were taking the classes, the AP classes intensified, but they weren't enrolling in college at the same rates as their other students. And so we began the United Minority Girls program to help them through that college application process. So I think we need to do a lot of listening to students. I think there's a lot of education we need to do for staff. I mean, because they need to understand that every student that comes into our classes are brilliant, capable students. Mm-hmm. And it may not look like a student that you traditionally thought should be in this class, but they have every right to be in the class and can be successful with the right supports and the right encouragement. Some of the other things we need to do is look at where's their bias in our identification process. Mm-hmm. 2 years ago, we had one of the assistant principals ran some numbers to look at kids that were in the AP class and what their SOL and test scores look like, grades in previous courses look like, and then went and found many students who had that same pattern but were not in AP classes. And when we talked, most of them were minority students, and when we talked to them, they said, no one mentioned this to us. So we have been very purposeful in outreach. So, Mr. Gregory, I want to thank you for organizing this. I do have to step away in about 5 minutes, but I wanted to join in for as much as I could.
Appreciate it, Dr. Wilmore. So, another thing is that we have to look at the area that we're in as well. And we're in a very migrant area, right? And there's a lot of people that come in and out of Arlington all the time. So we have to make sure that we're also engaging them. So it's not just at the beginning of the school year or in the summer, but it has to be something that's continued throughout the school year of letting people know who are entering into Arlington that these opportunities are available to them. And then we have to look at our process to make sure that in terms of our selection process, in terms of our criteria, that is not weeding out some students from having these opportunities who may have come from another neighboring school system or out of state. So we have to really take a look at and being intentional to make sure that everyone is supported. And it's really about providing those supports so that you feel comfortable that with those advanced academic classes that you're able to tackle them, that you feel supported, and that you're able to succeed in them. And it's not just so much about just taking a class, but we have to make sure you get the credits for the class and meeting those components of that too, because that's very, very important. you don't want to go through all that hard work and not be able to say, have it upon completion, that you receive the credits for it. So, and I know that Mr. Hall is working on that and what that looks like. That's going to be a point that he's going to really be addressing when school gets back, is to make sure that you're successful once you get there, and stay in the class.
Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Gregory's right. I know that he and I have talked about it when I was shortly before I was appointed to the position. I know that Dr. Duran and I talked about it. Young people, it is an economic issue for many of our families, these AP and IB courses, because I can tell you one of those, if you juxtapose that with a college course, 3 credit hours in many places is $1,000, $2,000, $3,000. So if we can continue to put our young people in the high schools in a position where you're not only passing the class, but you're doing well at such a high level that you're passing the AP or IB exam, that is $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 off your tuition bill going into a 2 or 4 year school when you're passing these college classes for free. That is we know that college is becoming, the affordability of college is a significant barrier, especially for families of color. So if we can begin to really raise the bar in terms of making sure our students are doing well in AP and IB, passing the test, and then taking those college credits on to those 2 or 4 year universities, you matriculate faster and it saves you and your family money. So we got to think in terms of a real world benefit, not just the knowledge, but financially as well.
Anything you wanted to add, Dr. Duran, before we move to the next question?
Yes, I would say also what we have to do, and you're asking as high school students, but this is another thing we're doing in our school system. We have to make sure at elementary and middle school that we're providing the courses that are preparing and helping build the foundation, so that when you have access to these courses, that you're able to be successful. So it's not just about having access at the high school level, which is very important. We just had a conversation about that and how we need to make sure we're not putting up barriers for students to be able to participate. But you have to be able then to get into the class and be successful, and that success at the high school level is founded upon all of the learning that you should have had in elementary and in middle school. So I say all that to say we're also looking at how do we strengthen our advanced learning opportunities in elementary and in middle school.
How about Alana? We haven't heard from you yet. Are there any questions that you have?
All right, so I was gonna ask how APS plans to address the disproportionate, in minority students, of how many school days are missed because of out of school suspensions. So how does APS plan to address that?
Well, first I'll start and I'll let others join in. One thing that we're doing now is we're revising and looking at our student code of conduct. And we are looking at how we make sure that consequences are appropriate for when you're out of school. And those should only be consequences that are for very serious physical harm, things that actually break the law, if you will, things that require you to be out. But for things that are more disruptive, maybe disrespect to teacher, maybe an argument that you may have had, how do we build in a different type of consequence so that you're not out of school? And what we see in the data, we look at when students are disproportionately out of school, the way you outlined, Alana, we see a lot of them are for things like that, what we would call defiance or disrespect or being disorderly. Those are the words that are used in terms of codes. And when we think about that, that's often disproportionate because students are perceived differently when they're a student of color. Myself, I can say, as a tall, 6'2" Latino male, if I get loud or argue with someone looks at me differently than someone who might be shorter or not Latino, right? So how do we look and respond to things? So there's part of that is training for our staff and how do we understand that? But then there's also the actual rules and the code of conduct where we would make sure that we are not putting students out for those reasons. So that's something we're beginning to work on now at the division level. And I'll let Mr. McCall and I don't know if Dr. Wilmore's still on. They want to add some of the things that schools are doing more specifically to that. But what I wanted to share was the changing of the policy, which is very important.
Alana, thank you for the question. I appreciate the question. So, Alana, if I could start with an example from my own experience in high school, if I could, and I'll bring it full circle. You know, I was a comedian in high school, and there were many a day when I would say something in geometry class where Dr. Novotny would remove me from class, and it was just to get some people laughing. But I would find myself out of class a lot of days as it relates to that. What I think was lacking in that situation is there weren't many one-on-one conversations with Dr. Novotny and I in terms of how was I doing in geometry? Was the work such that this was something that I was doing as a defense mechanism? How could he better support me in the class? There weren't many of those conversations. I think those are important. I think those are the type of restorative conversations that teachers need to have more with young people in terms of if there is a situation in class where a student feels uncomfortable and a student says something that a teacher may or may not find untoward, then how can you strengthen the relationship between that teacher and that student so that that student doesn't end up in an assistant principal's office? So I think those restorative conversations are important. And again, Alana, we talked about the vulnerability part of it. We have to continue to be vulnerable in that process as adults and realize that your voices are important. And we need to listen in those moments of restorative conversations with y'all. So I think that is important. So putting together the restorative conversations, sort of the social emotional piece where people can feel free to speak, Alana, in these situations where there are tough conversations that may lead to difficult to disciplinary consequences. And Dr. Duran is right. I think there's been a big push, not only in Arlington, but in other municipalities to eliminate what gets a student suspended versus what doesn't get a student suspended. And I think if you're clear on that, Alana, I think you also need to know that as well. I think in talking to students about those revisions in the disciplinary code to reduce suspensions for minority students, we need to make you aware of that. I think there's a Know Your Rights initiative at APS as well. You have rights as a student. We have the responsibility to make sure that you have that information so that in instances where there could be some alternatives to suspension, you know your rights, you know what the conversation should be with that teacher or that administrator. So, you know, Alana, it's a big source of discomfort for me as a principal. You want to make sure that students aren't being suspended for arbitrary reasons. And I think the conversations, the restorative conversations to make y'all feel comfortable and supported in those classrooms, those are going to be important going forward. It is about listening. It is about making sure that the supports are in place so that students don't feel like they're put in a situation where there has to be some sort of disciplinary consequence.
And I would just add on to that is that, you know, the role of educators is to really teach students how to critically think. And that means that you're able to question and have questions and have those questions answered. So we have to get to a place where we train ourselves to not think of that as being, you're challenging me by asking the question. And that's a point of training for staff is that you're able to ask questions in class. It should be able to, without feeling that you're challenging a teacher, and then you're looking at disruptive behavior within the classroom. So how can we be consistent with our policies, and how can we be consistent with, hey, Alana did something versus Nyla did something versus Kirsten did something? Is it across the board and even and fair? And I think that's really what students want. They just want someone that they want to know what the rules are, and they want fairness, so that if a person gets a punishment or something for doing the same thing and the other one doesn't, then that's looking at fairness, and then they're going to have a problem with that. So, you know, there's a great educator that I follow, Dr. Christopher Emden, and he does hip hop ed, and he's one of my favorite guys and a friend of mine. And what he did is in his classroom, he actually had ciphers. So his cipher was all of his students, and they had a voice, and they got to tell him exactly everything that he did that caused them to be in an uproar. Like, you know, you raise your voice, or you did this, you did that. But that was about building relationships. So we have to really work on that relationship piece. within our classrooms, and for you all to be able to have that voice, because what we do know is that when our teachers talk less, it facilitates more discussion and more conversation, and students learn more. So I think that's where we're trying to go as a school division, is really just giving you all that voice and that opportunity, and really looking at fairness and what can we do to make sure that we're fair. Is there anything you want to add to it more?
I would just add in what I would like to see us doing more in APS is addressing some of the underlying causes sometimes that our students are dealing with. I tell our staff all the time, our kids are coming in and acting the best way they know how. But a lot of them are dealing with trauma, they're dealing with stress, they're dealing with difficult home life situations, and school is a safe space to lose it. And I've shared a number of times with a number of people. I think it's interesting, APS, when we recognized the situation of drug and alcohol abuse, we created the Second Chance program to provide education and skills for students to avoid a repeat of that behavior. But we repeatedly suspend students for defiance and disrespect, and we have nothing in place to teach them anger management, stress management, coping skills, navigating conflict, and conflict resolution. When we send them out of school or even to ISA, that's not teaching them anything. They come back just as angry, just as stressed, just as overwhelmed, just as frustrated, if not more so. So I think that's something that we as a system should be looking at.
Yeah.
I see.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know how to click raising hand on here, but yes, I have another question. Since you're speaking of disciplinary actions, I was wondering, going forward, how are you planning on holding students accountable for racist jokes, comments, and instances? I think it's important to change the culture of just letting racist jokes be acceptable, because I do think it plays a really important part, especially in our developing years of like middle school.
Absolutely, and that's a really major part of our work that we have to be tight on. We cannot allow those comments and jokes and things to occur. And so there's several things that we have to do. I think first and foremost, we have to make sure that students know what to do in terms of when they're hearing those things and feel comfortable and confident that they need to report them. I've heard from a lot of students here recently, as well as in my previous districts I worked in, and even when I was a principal, who would tell me, "Well, I didn't know I should say anything. I thought it was a joke. I didn't feel good about it." But so educating everyone on the fact that we need to call those things out. I do think that also when we think about consequences, we have to put it into a program where we help students learn from their mistakes through that. And so the first time that people are talking about that and joking, we have the conversation, we let them know why it's not appropriate, and then we monitor and continue. And if people continue and go further with it, then there has to be additional consequences, because that turns into harassment, and that turns into really continually disregarding everyone. But sometimes for some people, it's just an awareness of, wow, what I just said was not appropriate. What I just said was offensive. And a lot of people have never been told that. And they think it's funny and they think it's a joke. And no one speaks up because we're uncomfortable or we don't know how. And then they keep doing it over and over again. And so I know it's not perfect, because there are some people who intentionally want to harm and hurt and be hateful. There are those people, and we have to deal with them very strongly, and that's not allowed in our school system. But I will say there's a large number who just don't know and are just saying things and doing things that are just dumb and really wrong, okay? And so we have to really respond to those differently. And so, Mr. Hall, I'll ask you to talk a little bit about how you do that and how you will do that. I know you've done it before in your previous role, but how you'll continue to do that. But what I would say to the students here, what I said to the middle school students before, we need you to be brave, be strong, and call those things out. Speak up about it. I think what we're seeing at the national level about the conversation that occurred recently with George Floyd and his killing, we're starting to see more people are speaking out that were silent before, that were just quiet. And people are, different incidents like happened in New York where the woman was, inappropriate with a guy who was bird watching and he spoke out, or people who did a video of women who was yelling at another couple in the parking lot, calling them names because of who they were. They spoke out. Before, people would hear that and just walk away and be like, wow, that's bad. That's, wow, did you just see that? Go home and maybe talk to their friends about it, their family, say, that was this crazy person or this awful, hateful person. But then no one said anything to anyone besides that. So it's a lot of different parts, is my answer, that we have to do. We need students to step up and be brave and be strong, and we need staff to listen when you do, and we need to follow up appropriately. If it's a harassment, if it's an ongoing thing, we need a consequence. If it's the first time, we need to have a conversation and help people learn. Because I think part of being anti-racist is helping people learn, helping people see differently. All of us on this meeting call have done and said things that we didn't realize what we were saying was wrong. The first time someone tells it to us, we're like, okay, thank you. And we learn from that. Now, if you tell me that and you keep doing it, then that's a different problem.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Hall.
Nyla, I can recall an incident where a student, a white student, was using their Snapchat had got out. Somebody viewed it. They used the N-word on their Snapchat, not necessarily in a way that was incendiary or cruel, but they just used it in a way that they saw someone else use it conversationally. It spread around the school. We had multiple students, white and black, come seek me out and say, we saw this on this student's Snapchat. This is wrong. And not only this is wrong, but they were hurt. I could tell that they were hurt. They didn't know quite how to tell that other student that they were hurt, but they were. So what we did is we had a couple of conversations. First of all, with the student to whom the Snapchat belonged. We had that student have a courageous conversation about why they used it, acknowledging that it was wrong. But with the counseling department, we looped in the counseling department, and we were able to put together a video where there were some older black men and women who talked about the history of that word. Many of them who were brought up in the civil rights movement, and some who were a lot older, who were direct daughters and sons of slaves. And that was the only word that they were called. There was no name. It was just that word. And I think once that student was able to sit with that and be able to talk that over with the counselor, and not only that, Naya, but we were able to facilitate a conversation between that student and the students who first saw that Snapchat where the N-word was used, to sort of have a restorative conversation about, you know, the hurt that caused in the school community. And there are better ways of expressing yourself on in Snapchats if you're friends with individuals of color. That's not one of them. And I think that, as Dr. Duran said, there are increasing levels of sort of disciplinary consequences when we talk about things being used sort of in a joking manner. People are unaware, and people that are doing that in an incendiary fashion, Nyla. But I think that the restorative nature of that conversation, informing their parents that word was used and the hurt that it caused, and then really having that student sit with having older Black folks talk about the history of that word, first person examples of individuals who experience both emotional pain and physical pain from the N-word. I think it really hit home with that student. And I think that student's interaction with peers for the rest of that school year was quite different, and the energy was different. It was more respectful. It ended up being more positive of people's feelings as it relates to that.
So I would say from a systems perspective is that we need to look at it in three parts. The first part is how do we become proactive to make sure that these incident situations don't happen and go on, through education, through programs, and really supporting you all to be able to have these conversations, to be able to speak up, speak out, and be anti-racist. The second part is, what do we do when an incident does happen? What is our approach within the school system when something does happen, and how are we going to respond to it? And then the third part of that is, how are we going to restore the harm that was created by that incident, and to also make sure that it doesn't happen again? So we're putting those systems in place. We have some structures that are already in place, but we want to make sure that they're strengthened, and to provide the support throughout the whole school system so that everything is consistent across all the buildings. in all the high schools and all the middle schools, all the elementary schools. And what we do know is that, what research and data shows us is that at the age of 3, the typical person had already identified race and understands it is better to be white than it to be anything. And that's at the age of 3. So how do we start having these conversations a lot sooner, knowing that students do recognize differences? It's okay to be different. We're all different, but we all are the same too. So we're really trying to work on that with you all, and we want even some advice and some feedback, from the students that you're hearing these words from. Where is that rooted from? How do we help combat that? How can we help you navigate that so that you're not alone and you don't feel alone? Can you give us some, give us some wisdom? Give us some of your wisdom. How do you deal with that? Hey, Kirsten, I see your hand.
Yeah. Oh, I was just. Oh, so it was kind of. It's basically the same, I guess. But I was wondering, for obviously this is like high school, but like for, are you like also planning on like doing this stuff really early? Because as you said, like kids already know what race is like when they're young. So I remember personally in elementary school, like no one was ever like they didn't mean anything by it, but like they would, like I looked really different from them and I was in a really white school, and so, people would ask stuff that like was not good. And so I was just wondering like for like, little kids, or is there going to be some kind of program that's like, there are like, I don't know, different people, and like some of the things that you might hear that are stereotypical like are not good to, it's like I don't know, you know.
So we are going to, approach our elementary schools, and a lot of their principals and teachers are engaging in conversations with me and Dr. Duran about what we can do to increase awareness, and also engage with our PTAs and those parents, so that we know a lot of things are what people see at home, what we see in the media, on TV, and we bring them into the schools and those types of things. So we have to start having those conversations a lot sooner, and I think we're going to do that. There's some things I have in store that we can't talk about right now until they've been finalized on how to make that happen. But we have plans, to make APS really an anti-racist school system. And we know that things happen, and they're going to happen. We're going into a heavy politicized year, right? And it's an election year, and we have to be aware of that. And we have to be aware of those things that are going on around us. But our job, again, is to help you and to be able to help you navigate this world that we live in, that we exist in right now. And we're here to do that together with you.
Can I ask something? I was also wondering about because as you said, it is like a heavily political year, but I think I remember when I was a freshman, there was there was a person who believes that, sometimes talking about this stuff and just the general idea of, like anti-racism or whatever, that was like counter to his political values in a way. And so I was wondering, is there a way to say, I don't know, that this sort of thing, it's just about treating people better. It's not about, it's not as just so it doesn't get caught up in that, I guess.
Yeah, that's definitely very important, because there are different political views that people have, which you're talking about, but this is about respect. This is about making people feel welcome. This is about making people feel that they are safe. And so that's how we will frame this. This is about all students, when you come to APS, must be respected, must be safe, must be welcome. And we're not going to get into the politics, as you said, and this is an election year. We have a new, people running for president and all this and that, and there'll be a lot of conversations. And there is some right now even happening, right, as we even see what's gone on in all the media that we're hearing. But in APS, we're not going to be caught up in that. We're going to be caught up in making sure that we create a welcome, safe, respectful environment for everyone to be here. And I think that is important. I'm glad you asked that question, Kristen, because it's very important that we help people, Kristen, to see that difference. And people will want to talk about the politics. That's fine. There's good. I think particularly at the high school level, we need to have engaging conversations, and we want students to be politically active. But we have to make sure we respect also the different political beliefs that they bring. So part of this work is even honoring different voices as long as they're respectful again. But that's very important to us that we do that. And it's something that we thought about. And as Mr. Gregory said, I've been talking about a little bit of a way to do that with some activities at the secondary level. I see Officer Brooks came on the camera, so maybe we don't want to forget about him. He's here. I know we'll have about 9 minutes. So I just see you turned your camera on. Thank you, Officer Brooks. Gave some nice comments last time. So Mr. Gregory, I know we'll have about 9 minutes, but I don't want to forget since he took the time to be here with us, which was very appreciative.
Are there any questions you have civic to Officer Brooks that you want to ask? Or have him maybe even talk a little bit about his initiatives and what he is planning on doing within Arlington. So we've been talking last week, and he has some real good ideas of what he wants to do, and he's getting support from his superior officers to go forward and do that in Arlington. You want to talk about that, Mr. Brooks?
Sure. Thanks again for having me. I definitely appreciate it. I want to definitely shout out Aaron, Mr. Gregory for reaching out to me and allowing me to sit in and listen to, these young voices that, have made so many great points. And you all think about so much that I didn't even think about when I was going through high school. And also Mr. Hall, I worked with Mr. Hall the last 2 years at Swanson Middle School. He was, one of the assistant principals there, and I'm happy for him, but I'm kind of sad because, if we'll be back at the middle schools, hopefully with schools resuming, and I'm going to miss seeing his face there, but I can always duck into WNL. But in terms of what I'm doing, with me being a school resource officer, the most important thing to me is having positive impact. Growing up in a neighborhood where, growing up, I did face a lot of discrimination. I did face a lot of racism in Richmond, Virginia. I feel a sense of a calling to do this job, and I sense a bit of a calling to have positive relationships with, the citizens, as a whole, but in my role as a school resource officer, talking to the youth, making those, positive contacts, because there is a lot of distrust going on, in the country right now, and, over the past few decades, and even, expanding beyond that. And so it's something that I take very seriously. And, I'm in a good position right now to where, my job is giving me the opportunity to come up and think of ideas to have positive engagements and, provide safe spaces for dialogue, such as what we've, discussed today. And so I have, a few events that I'm planning. I've had some cookout ideas where I would love to, get, a lot of you to attend, and we can have these conversations that they are tough to talk about. But I think it's important because we do need to listen to one another. More so as police officers, we need to listen more to you because you are the ones that we serve. And, in terms of for there to be any changes, there are a lot of things that, that I may not know that you are experiencing. And so, I can only speak from the perspective of, a Black man who has experienced these things, but it spans just beyond race, and so having those conversations, getting to know one another, I think those are the steps that we can take to, having positive change. And so I look forward to working with Mr. Gregory and Mr. Hall and with the superintendent as well, just on some of the ideas that we have, because that's the only way things are going to improve or move forward. And so I welcome any questions if anyone has anything now, but I do look forward to some of the other these meetings.
So I would say this for with everyone go, is that in 2 weeks on the 22nd, we're actually going to be discussing policing. So he will be back. So we can save those questions for that time when he comes back, and maybe you can use this period of time to think about some questions that you have. Also want to engage you all with the poll and really look at poll results about policing, and some ideas. And then also, hopefully you can talk to your friends, and we can have more people at the high school level to engage in this conversation. It came up during the community Let's Talk, and it also came up, during the registration here, is that there's really a lot of questions that you all have about policing and police, and um, the way they respond to incidents, how they address, people of color versus other nationalities, and those types of things. And those questions are coming up, and we want to be able to answer those questions for you. So I will just want to leave it at that, that in a couple of weeks, we are going to have that conversation, and we hope that we have more of you that want to be a part of that conversation with us. Are there any, I guess, lasting or parting questions that you all may have in terms of the series, in terms of the why? How can we make this more engaging for you? How can we better engage some of your some of your peers in having this conversation? I know it's summertime and everyone has a lot of things going on. Well, what are your thoughts?
Are we allowed to share this information with other people? Just okay. I wasn't sure if this was just like a closed meeting.
So this is really about students. So we ask that we just limit this conversation to students. At a later, there will be other additional times when we're going to open up to the community again and to everyone. But really, this is really a safe space for you students to be able to talk about these topics.
Okay, because I didn't know people who are interested.
And then I was going to say it's being recorded, so I'll have it posted on the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion website under Community Engagement tomorrow. So if you want to, you can share the video with your friends.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to thank everyone for being here and the conversation. I have to have a meeting now in a few minutes, so I'm going to sign off, but thank you and look forward to future conversations.
Thank you, Dr. Duran.
Thank you, Dr. Duran.
So we have about 2 more minutes. Anything else that you all wanted to? I know I have another meeting too coming up at 2 o'clock, but you got me for another couple minutes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something real quick because I never got to. I just want to say thank you for your answer, Mr. Hall, about what I was asking about how I think we address issues. Trying to remember what you said. Oh yes, you were saying that a lot of it is not knowing that these jokes are harmful and where they stem from. I know I learned the origin of the N-word and what it means, and I've learned all my Black history at home, or the true story. So I really hope that I kind of want to know if you can answer real quick how you will implement that or put those lessons into a school system, because I feel like some parents will reject that and won't want that.
No, that's a good question, but I think the response is, I think we have a moral obligation and a duty as educators to tell the truth. These aren't things that we're making up. I mean, the history is replete with incidences of how the N-word has damaged Black communities, decimated them, and all of that. So I think in talking about those through the literature and English classes, The Warmth of Other Suns is a book about the Great Migration of Black people from the South to the North. Well, we know that those people moved from the South to the North because they were experiencing intense racism. We can talk about a book like The Warmth of Other Suns. I think that the use of the Jim Crow laws, and how those were basically born out of racism, I think is important in social studies. That's the truth. And I think that we need to be able to, as administrators and teachers, tell our parents who may be angry and uncomfortable about these truths that there is an importance in telling them. So that's for us to talk to those parents and those parts of the community who are uncomfortable with that. They may not be anti, I don't want to talk about that, but they're definitely uncomfortable. We know that sectors of the community are uncomfortable about it. We got to speak truth to power.
And I will say this too, is that, I know W&L, you're getting ready to get a, outstanding, through African-American history class, that Antoinette Waters and Miss Waters is using a curriculum over at Wakefield. So that class is going to be expanding over to W&L. Also, Yorktown is adding a class about African American history, but we also know it's not just about African American history, it's American history, right? So we dropped that African American because we are a part of America, and as well as our Asian friends and families are part of America and part of this history, just like everyone else is. So we need to start telling the whole truth about our Native Americans and Christopher Columbus, and we need to talk about Thomas Jefferson and those statues that are now coming down that are Confederate. We have to have those honest conversations about that.
Mr. Gregory, can I just interject real quick? I got a meeting at 2:00.
So do I.
Yeah, ladies, thank you. Email me if you have any suggestions. My email, my Twitter account. Please send some feedback to me, please. Okay.
So I hope you join us in a couple of weeks. And we're going to be talking about policing and really going to go and dig even deeper and go even deeper in these conversations. So I appreciate all of you. Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Brooks, for joining us. And, I know he's going to be back in a couple of weeks and there'll be some others so we can really start talking about the things that you want to talk about and engage with this. So thank you for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.